Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, we looked at the early publicity, allegations, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering of lawyers and claims agents during the 17-day evacuation, as well as the experiences spill victims had in settling claims. We now continue with Part 6 and conclude Chapter 2, followed by Chapter 3. Chapter 2, Claims. Petty Creek area. Jamie Becker above Southside Road said her husband Bill's health worsened. His doctors kept very good records on him. They showed his health declined rapidly after the spill, his lungs primarily. The Beckers negotiated, holding off on a lawsuit. Becker's impression was that payments were based on zones where people lived. From what I was told via the grapevine, settlements were similar, she said, in the zones. If MRL generally paid claims based on location zones, this model ignored duration of exposure, pockets of gas, and later exposures, as well as variability in health response. Beyond the exclusion zone, settlement offers reportedly were made for merely any inconvenience. Though her husband had a legitimate claim that his COPD had been made worse, negotiations took an abruptly sour turn in 1999. Becker said, MRL's claims agent laughed in my face because the Beckers had missed the statute of limitations to file a lawsuit by 3 days. Ethics aside, MRL no longer had a legal reason to pay. Fortunately for the Beckers, with the judge's extension, they joined a class action suit. In 1998, Paul and Marlene Lodge had yet to settle and felt the pressure of the approaching 3-year deadline. Paul, fortunately, had health insurance, as MRL paid no medical costs, but was concerned that spill-related health problems might continue. What we asked for was just strictly the assurance that if down the road health problems continue, that I'll have health coverage for that. I said, well, it won't cost you a penny if I turn out not to have any complications, and they don't want anything to do with that. MRL's offer was something like $3,500 for the both of us, he said, each. Lodge characterized his eventual settlement as a couple years' worth of health insurance. Jay Stiles of Southside Road said MRL would only pay for medical treatment that they authorized. In 1997, he said, Signal Casualty became the new insurer for MRL, the next level, and they began balking at payments, and eventually Stiles was on his own. Thank God I have insurance, he said. I'd be in the poorhouse. Because Stiles had long-term health issues, the family waited before attempting to settle. I went to Signal Casualty with my receipts and medical bills and whatnot and told them I would have to have at least this much. Before we could start talking, they just said, you've got to be nuts. There's the door. And the agent was really nasty. They're a bunch of jerks. The Stiles filed a lawsuit. Larry Mickelson thought the claims process a big joke. They initially offered us $1,500. Initially, that was for both of us. Then they came back and offered us $2,500 apiece, including some lost wages. There was no consistency, he said. The claims tent was a bit like, let's make a deal, but Mickelson had little leverage. Mickelson waited over a year to settle separately from his wife. Her health problems were worse, he said. For what I settled for, I didn't think it was appropriate for her to do that. Because some symptoms worsened since he settled, Mickelson later felt he'd made a mistake. I don't feel my compensation was even a fraction of what it should have been. We've been duped, Dixie Robertson lamented in 2000. I think the railroad's goal was to get as many people settled as possible before they really knew what the impact would be, and I think they accomplished that. There seemed no logic for the variability of the settlements. Offers depended on the claims officer's mood, she said, or how much knowledge he thought the people had. It was totally random. The only way I can describe what happened down there at the claims office was that it was psychological warfare. I've seen families split up over it. Basically, the financial part of that was closure to a lot of people. It'll be done with. It'll be gone and go away. MRL pressured her husband because he wanted closure, and she gave in to early settlement, concerned about the unity of her family. She knew people who divorced because of the spill. The sad part of that, Robertson said, was, man, They made the settlement so fast. We didn't know what was going on with us. Robertson recalled one resident whose car had broken down, and the claims officer offered him $1,000 to sign off, saying he didn't deserve as much. And then they were really verbally abusive to him, she said. They were very degrading. They were professionals. They knew what they were doing. And these people, the victims, were not mentally capable of handling this at the time. You were just devastated anyways. I've watched neighbors who were friends for years not talk to each other. They divided this town. Alberton wasn't a close town anyway, she said, a cliquey little burg. But, she said, there were railroaders who put their life in the railroad. They really believed that MRL wouldn't do that to them. Really believed it. I've seen it evolve where they come around and say, well, the railroad really doesn't give a damn about me. Steve Adams felt MRL took advantage of victims by coming out here and throwing money, he said. And they started out throwing phenomenally small sums of money. Some of these people settled for $1,000. Adams waited and said his family received substantially more. So basically, they cheated a bunch of people in the beginning by telling them, oh, no, nobody's going to get any more money. This is all that it's worth, blah, blah, blah. And it was all bullshit. The people that waited it out got more money. Adams guessed that maybe half of all claimants settled quickly. Mostly the poor people, he said. The people that went in there and trusted them got screwed. 3 to 4 months after the spill, Adams said, claims officers threatened to shut down any more talks, inviting people to sue, and so he settled. John Greenwood of Petty Creek Road had health insurance until December of 1996. When that ended, MRL stopped paying toward medical bills. Later, the Greenwoods paid for a visit to Jewish National Hospital in Denver, out of her own pocket, he said, and it came just near close to bankrupting us. In 2001, they couldn't get health insurance. After stopping medical payments, MRL pushed for a settlement. What they were attempting to do was financially force people to settle, and they succeeded with a lot of people. Absolutely, they crowded them financially into a corner and stuck it to them, Greenwood said. And some people are pretty bitter that went ahead and settled, because they feel they got taken advantage of, Carol Greenwood said, including herself. No, we're not satisfied, because all it would take was one big-time hospital bill, and we're bankrupt. Because of newfound reactive airways, they had to sell their horses, quick and cheap. So basically, she said, I look at Montana Rail Link as stealing my dream, which they did. The Greenwoods sold off some of their acreage to pay their bills. They also sold their bar in March 2001 because of sensitivity to indoor smoke exposure. Meanwhile, John tried for 2 years to get Social Security disability, but was disqualified. If I was stone cold dead, then I might qualify, he said. The Edgars on Eddy Road claimed MRL claims agents verbally abused them, helping inspire their lawsuit. The agents belittled us, down-talked us, told us they were providing us a vacation for free in Missoula, Stephen Edgar testified. His family had been exiled from their home, injured, and the guy tells you that you're a bunch of hillbillies and you're lucky to get what you're getting and you should be thankful for the vacation they're paying for. Wayne Wasser's son Conrad was exposed at the 9-mile roadblock. He told Lisa Mosca in 1998, MRL's got this strict policy. They won't pay any medical bills unless you settle with them. So I had to go take out a bank loan to pay Conrad's hospital bill. Wasser owed about $10,000. I ain't going to settle, he said, because I don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. Do you know how many people settled with them and then they're having all kinds of problems? From Wasser's perspective, Denny Washington was responsible for the first $1 million out of this, he said. He spent that money on the people of Alberton. He spent that money putting them in motels, feeding them. He spent that money on PR work. As soon as his $1 million was spent, boy, that changed quick. Because as soon as the insurance company took over, they dropped everything. They dropped everything in a heartbeat. The spill ruined his marriage. It broke the family up, he said. I had to move. I had horses. I had pigs. I had sheep. I had a garden area I spent months working on. I asked them for help moving. They wouldn't give any. He asked MRL to oil the gravel road in front of the house because of Conrad's severe asthma. They wouldn't do that, he said. Mosca briefly interviewed Conrad, who at age 9 was very shy. He told her that before the spill he could play many sports. Now, he said, I can't run a lot. Like when I'm playing tag, I almost have to stop and rest every 2 minutes. Everyone runs up the stairs at school except for me. I'm the last one in the class almost all the time. Sometimes I'm late for school because I can't ride my bike that fast. And if I do, when I get to school, I'm having breathing problems. Where do you put a price tag on a kid that can't be a kid? His father asked. And I'll tell you what, that little kid there, he'd go in front of any jury in this country and he'll be awarded more money than anybody's ever thought of. Wasser's quest for a big payback had nothing to do with greed. Wasser was angry. The West Exclusion Zone. Diane Roberts of Sawmill Gulch settled within a couple months. But at the time we were doing very poorly financially, she said, and I think that more or less caused us to settle faster than we should have. Insurance agents pressured her as well. It was only when Roberts talked to an agent that she saw a map showing that the Sawmill area should have been evacuated April 11. But the belated April 15 evacuation was not a bargaining point. Ha! We got offered less, she said. And now that I see all these different symptoms and things that happened after, even further after than when we settled, my gosh, we were stupid. Sewer Resident 1 settled May 1996. I felt pressured to settle as cheap as possible. It's their job to get it down to as low as possible on everybody because basically it's the insurance company that's paying for it, not MRL. Robbie Flynn of Sawmill Gulch said Dennis Washington hid behind his insurance company. He spent $12 million to build a home in Southern California, but he wouldn't give health coverage to anybody in Alberton, nor would he give any kind of medical testing that needs to be done. People had to go out on their own and get medical testing, Flynn said. Beyond the exclusion zone. Roxanne Zyman of 6 Mile Valley had pre-existing asthma and was hospitalized from her exposure. Emerald's initial concern extended to the whole family, and they even offered to clean the Zymets' house. They were being very cooperative, Roxanne said. John said they decided to go to the National Jewish Hospital in Denver for Roxanne because there were specialists down there that deal with chemicals and people who have asthma, he said. Local pulmonologist Dr. William Beckemeyer concurred. The Denver hospital discovered burns in Roxanne's lungs. MRL never did pay for it, John said, because when we went down to Denver, I turned that into them, and they said, you want to settle, we'll pay for the hospital. I said, no, and then we got a lawyer after that, and they quit talking to us. We've been lucky, Roxanne said, because John didn't miss any work, and having decent health insurance has helped. Typical one-week hospital visits for Roxanne ran up to $17,000. Lucky, considering debilitating toxic exposure. Despite that 6 Mile was never evacuated, and MRL's legal stance that gas did not affect areas much beyond Alberton, MRL contacted 6 Mile residents, according to Dan Lundell. He says, well, do you want to come in and settle? Lundell recalled of Dale Ruse, an MRL claims adjuster. The third time he called, I told him, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm having a hard time swallowing. I almost choked to death the other night, and I'm having a hard time breathing. He never called me back. I never did nothing about it. The time must have ran out, so I'm out of luck. In retrospect, Lundell felt he should have gone for the $5,000 that he heard people were being offered. Just insurance-wise, he said, that would have been good enough for me to pay the medical bills and get the medicine like I should be getting. Health insurance covered about 80% of his medical costs. So we just don't go in, Lundell said. I don't have that kind of money, so you live with it. He had to quit his artwork because of his new sensitivity. You'd think they'd do more about helping the people that were involved, and they're not doing that, he said. All they're doing is fighting it. Lacking health insurance, Charlotte Ringlob and her Huson family were covered by Medicaid because of Ringlob's disability. It's been covered since '98, she said, but there was almost 2 years there. We ended up in bankruptcy because of the illness and not able to work, and meds. Ringlob knew people who absolutely refused to think of the spill as being a cause for post-spill illness. They just won't even consider the fact. Even my husband has a hard time admitting that the spill made us sick. Her family filed suit. They wanted us to settle out for, God, just chicken feed. It wouldn't do us any good. It would do us more harm than good in that I would lose all my disability benefits for about a year, and then I'd have to go back and get re-upped. It's just bullshit, she said. Deborah Ishler developed asthma from her exposure. Emerald paid for her doctor visits despite denying the gas reached Tucson. Dr. Gillespie tried all different kinds of inhalers and allergy medicine, she said. It seems to me that it was almost $300 a month if I were to keep up with the inhalers like he wanted me to do. A lawyer took note of Ishler's persistent cough and talked to MRL. I think they gave me $350 or something like that to basically keep my mouth shut, was what I was told. I wasn't after money. I just said, I'm looking at a lifetime of coughing and choking. If I have to be on medication, they should have to pay for it. Trudy Green of Hoole Creek developed RADS from her exposure, reactive airways dysfunction syndrome. When she later filed a claim, Emerald gave her a hard time because of her location. Had I not joined the class action suit, she said, I think they would have used that against me. You know, I think people would be a little more forgiving if we weren't talked to as country bumpkins by the big city insurance company people. To be treated as if there was not going to be any reason for any concern for long-term effects and then try to be convinced of that was pretty demeaning and hard to take. Beyond April 11, 1996. Rick Madge received his first exposure during the first animal rescue. While Katina Madge received some exposure on April 11 visiting Frenchtown, she thought a later exposure from off-gassing from the site soon after general reentry was more significant. Both had chronic illness and neither had health insurance. Emerald paid for some doctor visits and acknowledged that Katina had suffered symptoms, but only offered her $4,500. She filed a lawsuit. By 2001, Katina's lawyers dropped her suit. Yeah, they said they were only going to deal with people who had property damage, and we didn't have a house there, she said. The Madges filed for bankruptcy, and the bank foreclosed on the house they had recently built on Rock Creek. Exposed April 13, for Terry Stewart of Ponderosa Acres, the severe medical impact landed an economic punch. During evacuation, Stewart lost her job in hospice care. Her ophthalmologist wouldn't give her a medical release for her damaged eyes. After 2 months, Emerald's insurance agent told her, "We're not going to pay your wages the rest of your life." She felt she lost about a year's worth of wages. Because of her eye problems and respiratory sensitivity to chemicals, she could no longer work as an LPN. Yet, she was denied Social Security disability benefits in 1996. Though MRL originally covered much of her medical costs, she had substantial debt from them. Falling behind on payments, Stewart lost a new truck in 1996 and then her car in 1997. Unable to care for her horses because of sensitivity to dust and fly-white pesticide, she sold them in 1998. She listed her house 2 months after the derailment, but no one would even look at the property. She finally sold it in 1998 at a loss. Stewart filed a lawsuit. Amy Dietz of Bible Lane had her first exposure during the April 13 animal rescue. She settled early, but had no health insurance. Dietz said in 2001, "I didn't realize that I would have trouble like this. And so now that it's come out and I've gotten worse and stuff, I'm just stuck with the bills. And so that's probably why I haven't gone to a real lung doctor to get it checked and to get some help with it. Because I settled. I'm stuck." Fortunately, Dietz was still able to work. Leroy Strong worked for the Montana Department of Transportation and was exposed during a work visit to Alberton a few days after the spill. He developed nagging respiratory problems for years, but didn't get a real diagnosis until a significant secondary exposure of smoke triggered severe reactions. In great part, Strong let things slide because officials led him to believe that there was no health risk to his Alberton exposure. "I did a stupid thing," he said. "I should have gone to the railroad and said, 'Hey, I was out there and exposed to it. You guys owe me a physical. Let's see what's going to happen.' And I didn't." Under his retirement, Strong at least had health insurance. Eventually, the temporary claim set up in Alberton moved permanently to Missoula, and negotiations became more hardcore. Hodges. There was a lot of that intimidation where they wore you down, like you meant nothing to them, before they would even talk to you. One woman told Hodges they called her all kinds of names. If you wanted money, you had to settle. especially once the temp agents left Alberton. A lot of people didn't understand children's claims, Hodges said. Parents could only settle for minors with court approval. Otherwise, the child could sue the parents once he or she turned 18. Done legally, the money the child received was to be held in a trust fund. Hodges said people were taking settlements from the railroad, a small amount of money, couple thousand, for the kids, and spending it, doing whatever they needed, and now it's gone. The initial response by MRL was beneficial for evacuees. Food and lodging, vouchers for clothing, cash for various needs. MRL covered medical visits and promised to compensate for lost wages. The Missoulian editors heaped praise upon MRL. But none of this was largesse. MRL had put the evacuees in the position of needing help. MRL benefited as well, seen by many as doing the right thing, which bolstered their image of being responsive and responsible. To not help evacuees would have been damning to MRL. Helping was the least they could do. Furthermore, MRL had insurance. People reported a wide range of experiences with the claims process. Many people felt compensated, but many didn't, especially when they later suffered chronic medical problems. Some were financially devastated by the spill regardless because of medical expenses and the inability to keep their former jobs. The claims agents apparently said whatever they needed to induce people to settle as quickly and cheaply as possible. People felt they had to fight for a fair settlement, yet they were sick, traumatized, naive, and often suffering financial straits because of the spill. Many felt driven to a lawsuit as if victimized a second time, only now it was business. The stakes rose high in litigation, including the possibility of punitive damages. Plaintiff lawyers saw a potential bonanza. The typical client contract called for attorneys to receive 35% of any gross total recovery, 40% if an appeal, with fees and court costs deducted from the client's share, unless no recovery. All the more reason for both clients and attorneys to seek as high a settlement as possible. Along with the interminable burden of chronic illness, people with lawsuits faced a new type of long haul. But as many spill victims explained, it wasn't all about the money. What was fair compensation for being made ill, perhaps for the rest of one's life? As the long haul turned into years, Hodges wrote in 1999, MRL has continued to turn away from the injured families. Lawsuits have been filed out of desperation, and many of us at ACCEH have said goodbye to our friends who have been forced to leave and try to build a life somewhere else. The legal journey to justice was just gearing up. Chapter 3. Toxic Tort. The Case for Chlorine. MRL aggressively defended against claims of chlorine exposure with multifaceted strategies. Deny that chronic symptoms related to chlorine exposure. This strategy was automatic if chronic symptoms were not so-called classic chlorine symptoms. This limited such claims, which assumed severe exposure, to respiratory symptoms and perhaps skin and eye problems, the latter two bolstered by new documentation by ATSDR and ophthalmologist Dr. Rick Neumeister. Deny a chlorine relation based on prior medical history. For example, MRL pointed to Sam Austin's childhood history of asthma, while denying that chlorine exposure aggravated or reawakened his asthma. Likewise, pre-existing habits such as smoking were aggressively used against victims. Deny a claim of exposure or significant exposure because of timing, location, or duration of exposure. If victims didn't receive an exposure on the day of the spill, or didn't live relatively close to the spill site, or if the exposure was of brief duration, MRL used model assumptions about chlorine behavior to deny significant, if any, exposure. Blame the victim for failure to mitigate alleged damages. If a victim hadn't acted to minimize exposure if possible, this affected the medical consequences and reduced MRL's responsibility. If a victim failed to properly follow medical advice, the severity or duration of symptoms was the victim's fault. Timing in seeking medical help was particularly assailed. MRL emphasized that many plaintiffs sought medical care only after delay, quote, leading to the conclusion that either plaintiff's injuries were not as severe as claimed or that the symptoms did not arise when claimed. Emerell also argued that with victims' delay or failure to seek medical treatment, Emerell is entitled to a defense of contributory negligence. Finally, divide and conquer. An overarching tenet in mass exposure lawsuits was that individuals or families were more easily defended against because the above strategies could appear to be reasonably applied in a particular case, especially if juries weren't allowed to consider illness of the exposed population in general. All of these strategies were fair to use, but in Emerell's arguments there appeared no clear path for claims of chronic injury, despite the undeniable release of some 130,000 pounds of chlorine gas amid human beings. Even the seemingly least disputable cases of chlorine exposure, such as Sam Austin on the highway, were subjected to these strategies. So too were the engineers. Billy Shutter's chemical sensitivity, which prevented him from working at Emerell, was argued as psychological. Engineer John Caswell had a prehistory of bronchitis and asthma that cast doubts on chlorine-caused chemical sensitivity. As for exposures far from the site, in Edgars v. Emerell, the Roscoe Road family reported a strong chlorine odor inside their house and a very thick gas cloud, which caused immediate gagging, coughing, breathing difficulty, and burning eyes. The Edgars trees exhibited chlorine scorching, a needle bronzing documented in aerial mapping. Yet, they lived 6 miles from the site and 200 feet above the river. Emerell attorneys presented simple assumptions about chlorine gas behavior to argue that Edgars could not have received any significant chlorine exposure. Emerell also argued against chlorine exposures past the first day. In the Walsh case, the Walshes claimed repeated exposures while stationed near Petty Creek. The Edgars claimed that following re-entry, the residual chlorine odor was still so strong as to require that their home be cleaned professionally. As for mitigating circumstances, in deposing Caswell, Emerell attorney David Potter suggested the engineers might have pulled the pin earlier and spent less time exposed. Of Linda and Patrick Walsh, who helped evacuate residents of Alberton while risking their lives without respiratory protection, Emerell baldly claimed plaintiffs' complaints and claimed medical conditions are wholly unrelated to chlorine gas exposure and are predominantly the result of their own lifelong smoking habits. The "it's your own damn fault" defense. The Mayo et al. Case illustrated obstacles for what Emerell considered highly disputable cases. The Mayo case consisted of 2 families, the Mayos and Stewarts, who all lived on the Ponderosa Acres subdivision east of Petty Creek, over 5 miles from the spill. On April 11, Tammy Mayo said, "We could smell chemical odors that burned family members' skin, eyes, and throats. 2 children suffered chronic illness, including asthma-like symptoms." A few houses away, Terry Stewart and his children evacuated as the gas arrived, while Terry Stewart didn't receive her first exposure until the April 13 animal rescue. During her visit, she smelled chlorine and a pesticide-like smell. She developed asthmatic bronchitis, or RADS, chemical sensitivity, eye problems, and was plagued by various other symptoms. Emerell argued the Mayos and Stewarts lived too far away to receive significant exposure on the day of the spill, that later these areas were safe, and that plaintiffs such as the young Mayo boy had symptoms related only to prior medical conditions. Emerell's strategy was clear: deny all health problems as spill-related. In fact, Emerell's blanket denial applied to virtually everyone, including the dozens of Griffin et al. Plaintiffs who lived in Alberton. Attorneys wrote, "Indeed, Emerell questions both the existence and extent of chlorine exposure, particularly for plaintiffs whose residences were located several miles from the derailment site or who allege exposure during a brief re-entry into the evacuation zone several days after the derailment." Emerell also used the fact that no chlorine monitoring took place initially to back a general argument that no objective evidence exists that chlorine reached hazardous levels on April 11. Bolstering this argument was Emerell's failure to produce a promised model of exposure for April 11. Among Ted Lyon's 87 plaintiffs, The only case in which MRL did not contest significant exposure was Sam Austin, caught in a cloud on the highway. But MRL initially denied that chlorine worsened his asthma. MRL even questioned that John Elmer Smith Jr. had died from his chlorine exposure. The case for other chemicals. Plaintiffs' lawyers contended, though they didn't fully develop theories, that the chlorine and potassium cresslate, having reacted to form chlorinated compounds, led to a mixed gas cloud that migrated and caused chronic injury. Most of the allegation was based on victims' reports of a pesticide-like smell and reactions, even after general reentry. Plaintiffs additionally cited the bulk of the contaminated soil was left on site for almost a month after reentry, officials' confirmation that phenols smelled like pesticides, the Plum Creek letter regarding worker health complaints away from the site, and the electric co-op meter readers' odor and health complaints months later. MRL lawyers responded that plaintiffs cannot testify as to the wholly speculative alleged chemical exposure based upon an alleged pesticide smell or unnamed pesticide. Notably, they said, MRL concedes that there was a perceptible odor in the environment after the Alberton derailment, which is widely believed to have originated from the derailment or materials employed in the subsequent remediation. In his 1997 unpublished press release, MRL's Bill Brodsky referred to some fertilizer-type odors remaining at the derailment area, from harmless mercaptans that were in the spilled potassium cresslate, he said. Brodsky confused the sulfur smell of mercaptans with the pesticide and fertilizer smell of phenolics. But because any odor reported off-site was never identified, plaintiffs had no proof of what the odor was. This argument was bolstered by the Missoula Health Department's failure to identify any reported odors as promised. MRL argued against migration of chemicals other than chlorine despite any ongoing odor in the environment. Negative test results for residual deposition helped back them up. Federal Magistrate Leif Erickson ruled in Mayo that Terry Stewart's testimony on a, quote, bad smell was simply her observation, and the conclusion of it being a pesticide odor was likely within her realm of common knowledge. To the extent that the plaintiffs can substantiate that spill chemicals resulted in pesticide-type odor, the evidence is relevant to show the gases from the spill traveled to her house. But Erickson agreed with MRL that there was no medical evidence offered that other chemicals had caused injuries, and without that, exposure to other chemicals was moot. Plaintiffs conceded they had no experts to testify regarding injuries caused by other chemicals. Griffin plaintiffs tried to bolster the case for exposure to other chemicals with expert opinions. Dr. Kay Kilburn testified people were likely exposed to phenolic or chlorophenolic compounds based on plaintiff's skin, eye, and airway symptoms in the first 24 to 48 hours. Smelling was exposure. Still, he couldn't identify the exact compounds or dose or document migration. Later independent plaintiff testing turned up scant evidence of residual chemicals. Medical testing offered no help in proving exposure to specific other chemicals. There were no telltale biomarkers, and in fact, victims were having trouble proving that a variety of symptoms even related to chlorine exposure. Kilburn said, "There is no fingerprint for chlorine. There is rarely a fingerprint for any chemical exposure. For neurological symptoms, he had studied some 40 different chemicals, and the brain had a limited way of responding. It dropped functions. Likewise, chemical sensitivity could be initiated by many different chemicals." The plaintiff case for exposure to other spill chemicals boiled down to victims' complaints of a pesticide smell both close to and miles away from the site, the fact that phenolics and chlorinated phenolics smelled like pesticides, and claims of non-classic chlorine-related symptoms. In October 2000, Missoula County District Judge Ed McLean ruled there is sufficient evidence that some or all of these other chemicals may have combined to form and release airborne chemicals other than chlorine gas, which could form the basis for reports from numerous witnesses complaining of pesticide smells. He found no merit to MRL's claim of plaintiffs being unqualified to testify as to what they smelled. Accordingly, he wrote, whether plaintiffs were exposed to chemicals other than chlorine gas is a jury question. Undercutting this ruling was McLean's order excluding the, quote, unscientific testimony of Dr. Kilburn, the plaintiff's only medical expert regarding neurological symptoms. In the federal Austin case, plaintiffs argued Sam Austin was exposed to a mixed gas cloud on the highway. Austin smelled sulfur and chlorine on April 11, as well as some other toxic smell. At trial, the Austin jury only heard arguments of chlorine exposure, and Austin's medical claims were limited to aggravation of his asthma by chlorine. Plaintiffs risked clouding medical claims by trying to pursue allegations of exposure to other chemicals. In the third and final trial, Walsh v. MRL, Attorney Lyon again sought to introduce a claim of a strong pesticide smell that Patrick and Linda Walsh smelled after April 11 while working. The case judge ruled that personal observations of smells were admissible, but any evidence related to exposure to chemicals other than chlorine as a cause or potential cause of injury is precluded on the basis that no evidence in the record substantiates such a claim. Plaintiff's other chemical case came down to claims of odor, but they lacked clear data showing what exposure caused any alleged illness that wasn't caused by chlorine. Unfortunately, no health official had clearly answered returning residents' repeated questions. What's that smell? Why does it make me feel sick? Once officials determined lack of migration of a mixed gas cloud because of no evidence of residual deposition, they took no further interest in odor complaints or in verifying illness from these odors. Clear answers to these questions could have greatly helped residents. Chemicals other than chlorine were never considered by a jury. Arguably, it might not matter if plaintiffs could prove that so-called non-classic chlorine symptoms were attributable to their chlorine exposure. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we consider what was known about exposure to chlorine gases at the time of the Alberton spill, and what was understood about multiple chemical sensitivity. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.